Welcome to Anoka County's mini training, Increasing the CDCS Budget. In the orientation session, you learned that participants will be given a budget amount. Each person's annual state set budget is determined by the person's min-choice assessment, and it is the maximum amount for that particular plan year that they are entitled to based on their assessed needs. Participants are not able to roll over leftover funds from one plan year to another, and participants cannot be given more waiver funds beyond this amount, except in very specific scenarios. Let's talk more about those specific scenarios. There are 5 ways that you or your loved one potentially could receive an increase to your annual min-choice's calculated budget. You may request an annual 30% increase in very specific situations that we will explore in more depth. You could potentially qualify for an enhanced budget if you or your loved one was assessed for 12 or more PCA hours a day on the min-choice assessment, and you have staff that have gone through specific training approved by the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Another way to access more funds is when more funds are needed for home modifications. Some years, the state legislature decides to apply a cost of living or COLA increases to everyone's CDCS budget or to individual waiver types. And finally, you could see your budget increase after you have a min-choice's assessment because of a renewal or a change of condition. Let's look more closely at each of these scenarios. Your case manager may request on your behalf the 30% increase to your budget in these 4 different situations. If more funds are needed to increase the amount of time the participant works, improve their work opportunities, or needs more structured day activities. If more funds are needed to pay for formal behavioral services. If more funds are needed for additional support when moving to a new home. Or if more funds are needed in order to move out of an institution and into the community. Next, we will look more specifically at each of these 4 scenarios. The first situation for a potential 30% increase is if you are currently on traditional waiver and you are using licensed employment services, day services, or residential services and can demonstrate that upon switching to CDCS, your services would cost less annually with the 30% increased budget than continuing to use the licensed day or employment services that you are currently using in your current living situation. In this situation, you likely would be decreasing or eliminating licensed employment services and instead hiring an unlicensed person to provide some of the same functions as the licensed service, such as job searching and coaching. The next scenario that would justify up to a 30% increase is if the person on CDCS has a desire to increase the amount of time he or she works, improve employment opportunities, or need more structured day activities during the daytime to work towards potential employment opportunities in the future, whether it's paid or not. In recent years, there has been a push to help people with disabilities get to work. It is important to be a contributing member of our society, and research has shown that people with disabilities, just like anyone else, gets a great sense of worth and accomplishment from working, and the culture in the work settings for everyone improves. Additional services and supports include help with employment exploration activities, such as identifying interests and skills, learning about different job options, and/or may include volunteer or paid work experiences. There are also services to help individuals find more competitive, integrated employment or to become self-employed. Waiver funds may also be used to help the person keep their job once they find a job, like having a job coach to support you all or part of the time at work. CDCS funds can be used to pay for these types of services through licensed employment services, or the participant could hire someone through their FMS to help specifically with these activities. For example, you could hire someone to work with you 15 hours a week to help you look for jobs, practice interview skills, go with you to volunteer at the Humane Society for work experience, or be a job coach with you at your place of employment. Some participants, especially after high school and the transition program, may not quite be ready for a real job yet and may first need to learn to improve other skills needed for future employment, such as social communication and etiquette, emotional regulation, time management, and multi-step directions. If this is the case, you may need these additional waiver funds to pay an unlicensed staff person to work on these everyday skills during the daytime, or may need to go to an adult day program part-time to work on some of these skills. After high school, some choose the post-secondary education route to learn everyday independent living skills along with gaining work experience. If choosing this route, waiver funds can pay partially for some staffing and skill training at these settings, but parents will end up having to pay for most of the typical college expenses, such as room and board. Be sure to ask your case manager more about the different post-secondary options and what is allowed within each program. It is important to know that these increased funds are not automatically added to your budget each year. Your case manager must seek approval on your behalf each year from the Waiver Advisory Committee by completing EDOC 6633. This document then gets forwarded to Minnesota Department of Human Services to approve additional funds. There needs to be clear goals in your CDCS plan for how these funds will be utilized. In fact, there is a specific section in the plan for this information. For more information, go to the CDCS Manual Exception to Budget Methodology section. In your CDCS plan, there is a section that is just prior to the Environmental Modifications and Provisions section that asks the question, does your budget amount include the additional 20% increase, which is now 30%, however the form has not been updated, for individualized employment support or services during the day? If you select yes, then a few boxes pop up for you to complete. In the first box, you should just describe what your current employment supports or day services look like. In this case, we are saying that Henry attends a transition program during the school year, but does not have any employment services in the summertime, and he would like to make some money. In the next box, you just need to write briefly how you plan to use the additional 30% increase, which in this case is about $16,000. So this describes how Henry wants to start a lawn mowing business in the summertime. So he would like to hire someone to help him create flyers, distribute them, manage his schedule, supervise him, and help him learn to manage the money that he earns. The last box is an estimated amount you plan to need to accomplish this goal. People will often just put the dollar amount of the increase in this box. The specific staffing and job description and any other needed items may be mentioned elsewhere in the plan under the appropriate section. Another way to get up to a 30% increase is if you need more funds to pay for formal behavioral assessment and/or behavioral services. Behavioral services can be very expensive, so we do not want a limited budget to be a deterrent for getting the help your loved one needs in this area. If approved for these funds, there does need to be a formal positive behavior plan in place. In order to get a positive behavior plan, you typically need a formal assessment from an organization that does formal behavioral assessments. Otherwise, a positive behavior plan could be developed with the assistance of a mental health professional you may currently be working with or will be working with. We do have a blank positive behavior plan on our website if you would like to complete this form with the help of that professional. Please talk to your case manager about what your options are for both assessments and services. Once this formal component is in place, there may be multiple staffing, services, or equipment recommended, and the increased funds may be utilized for this. Typically, these funds cannot be used to increase paid parent of minor hours or spouse hours, unless the parent or spouse is implementing a very specific program in their home that takes additional time compared to what they were being paid for previously. The formal behavior plan may end up including more staff support, an alternative therapy, an iPad with specific apps, and more. Positive behavior reinforcers can be worked into the plan. These essentially are incentives to improve specific behaviors and can sometimes include items that typically would not be allowed on CDCS because they are wants instead of needs. I had someone tell me one time that they had their teenager with ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder diagnosis go to Target and take the gift registry gun and go around and register things that would help to reinforce good behavior. Then the parent printed the list and submitted it to the case manager along with the behavior plan the therapist helped them create, outlining how the reinforcers would be earned. The case manager could simply cross out items that would not be allowed as positive behavior reinforcers. See our guidelines for more information about positive behavior reinforcers. So the key to being able to access these funds is that there has to be a positive formal behavioral plan in place. This, like the other increased options, need to be renewed annually, the same way as the previous example with employment opportunities by completing the EDOC 6633 and getting approval from the Waiver Advisory Committee and submitting the form to DHS. This is what the positive behavior plan looks like. Be sure to have this completed with another professional. You will want to identify which behaviors you are wanting to work on, the outcomes you hope to accomplish, and what the plan of action is, including listing the positive behavior reinforcers that may be used. Please go to our guidelines for more information. The third situation regarding requesting a 30% increase is if you need more funds in order to move to a new home. For example, let's say you or your loved one is moving from the family home to their own home. In order to make this happen, they may need to use some licensed services or unlicensed service to help them find a place to live, or they might need assistance in paying for their moving expenses. Another example is for the participant to be safe, they need to install some monitoring technology such as sensors or alarms on the doors, or other technology devices to help reach caregivers when needed. Or maybe being out on their own, more staffing options are needed. These are all reasons to potentially request a budget increase up to 30%. Like these other budget exceptions, you do have to renew this annually through your case manager and show a continued need to access the funds. And lastly, if your loved one is institutionalized, like in the hospital, and has been ready to be discharged for more than 60 days without a place to safely go, your loved one could choose CDCS needing added services that might be more than what he or she is assessed for in the MinChoices assessment. This could possibly result in a higher budget amount. For example, maybe you can only go back home if you have 24/7 staffing, or 2-to-1 staffing, which normally is too costly on CDCS. This budget is then determined based on what is needed to get your loved one out of the institution and back living in the community. And then, depending on what this looks like, the budget will continue to be set accordingly on an annual basis. Again, to access these funds, the case manager will need to complete the EDOC 6633. An additional way to get an increase to your budget is if your loved one has extremely high staffing needs, is assessed for 12 or more PCA hours a day through the MinChoice assessment, and you have specifically trained staff. DHS offers free online training through Chainlink and some in-person training such as first aid and CPR. If all these things apply to you, you could request a 7.5% increase to your budget to compensate staff. You must use this increase on staffing. So you can give your staff, including paid parent of minors or spouses, up to a 7.5% wage increase or a bonus. In order to get this increase every year, your loved one does need to still be assessed for 12 or more PCA hours a day, and you still need to have eligible trained workers. For example, if your staff took CPR for the in-person training, that certification is only good for 2 years. You have to prove each year at renewal time that your training is still up to date. If you have staff that become eligible in the middle of a plan year, your case manager will prorate your budget back to the first day of the month staff became eligible. For more information about the trainings, ask your case manager or go to the Enhanced Budget page in the CDCS manual. And finally, there are some budget exceptions for home and vehicle modifications or environmental accessibility adaptations, also referred to as EAA. Each plan year, people on the waiver are eligible for up to $40,000 per year for EAA projects, if your county has this funding available. So the first step to an EAA project is to contact your case manager, letting them know what the need is and asking if this additional funding is available. Elderly waivers and the alternative care program are a little different in that the participants may only obtain up to $20,000 of EAA funding each plan year, but it also has to all fit within their CDCS budget. There is no additional funding to tap into. Sometimes an EAA project can cost more than the $40,000 limit, so DHS may approve more funds to cover those modifications. For instance, let's say your loved one uses a wheelchair and you need a ramp for your home, a ceiling lift, and a van modification, all at the same time for safety and accessibility purposes. This is going to cost more than the $40,000 limit. So your case manager can ask DHS to approve borrowing up to $40,000 into the next plan year. Sometimes you can avoid having to ask for an exception by splitting these projects into 2 different plan years. Let's say in this example, the modifications for home and vehicles are going to cost $60,000. However, your plan year is ending in 2 months. We typically will allow a 50% down payment to our contractors and providers. So in this case, you could put $30,000 down in your current plan year and pay the remaining $30,000 in the next plan year when the projects are completed. This would not be considered an exception and not need special DHS approval. There are a couple of other ways you could end up getting a budget increase. Budgets may occasionally be adjusted by legislative authority. An example is a cost of living adjustment, or COLA. Almost every year in the past 10 years, the Minnesota legislature and/or the SEIU union has voted to give everyone on a disability waiver an increase to their budget. The increase usually is not a lot, maybe 1.5% to 3% increase. This usually occurs after a legislative session and is implemented July 1st of that year. When this occurs, you will be notified by mail and asked how you would like to implement the increased amounts. There will be instructions on how to allocate the increase. The only other way to get an increased budget is really through your mid-choice assessment. When you do your renewal assessment, sometimes needs increase, or you hit a certain milestone age that allows for more needs to be assessed for, and according to the formula, allow for an increase to the budget. And finally, you can request a new assessment if you or your loved one has had a major change of condition that requires more help in everyday activities. For example, let's say you just get a diagnosis of autism and more needs come to light. This can cause a big jump to your budget to account for more staffing or sensory needs. Please contact the LTSS line at 763-324-1450 to talk about whether something qualifies as a change in condition or not. Otherwise, you can just wait to report this new diagnosis at your next assessment. And that concludes our mini training on increasing CDCS budgets. If you have any further questions or feel you or your loved one qualify for and really need a budget increase, please talk with your case manager.